Don't do this. I have nowhere else to go. She's only 4 months old.
Simone, you need to leave. This family has decided.
After everything I gave this family, you're really throwing me out?
You were never one of us.
Then tell me, why did you let me believe I belonged?
Just go.
One day, you'll regret these words.
From being dragged too fast down a driveway that seemed endless in the dark. And a woman's voice, cold and clipped and final, cuts through the storm like it was made for exactly this moment. You were never one of us. That is where this story begins. Not with a wedding, not with a birth, not even with a death, though all three of those things happened, and happened in that order, and happened to change everything. This story begins with a woman standing in the rain with a screaming infant on her hip and a single overnight bag holding everything she owns, watching a gate close behind her that she once believed she'd walk through for the rest of her life. Before we go any further, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 7 years later, Simone Carter is standing in front of that same gate again. She is 31 years old now, though there are moments, standing here, when she feels much older than that, and other moments when she feels exactly as young and as powerless as she did the night she left. The rain has just started, the first fat drops striking the shoulders of her coat, darkening the pavement beneath her boots one splash at a time. She hasn't touched this gate in 7 years. She has driven past the end of this road exactly once, on a day she told herself was an accident of geography, a wrong turn on the way to somewhere else, though she has never quite believed her own explanation for that. The iron bars in front of her are the same ones. The same scrollwork curls at the top, the same green patina eating slowly into the black paint near the hinges. Millbrook has not changed. Millbrook, she has come to understand, does not change for anyone. It simply waits, the way old money always waits, patient and untroubled by the passage of ordinary time, certain that eventually the world will come back around to it. In her hand is an envelope. The paper is heavy, expensive, the kind that costs more per sheet than she used to spend on groceries in the first hard months after she left this place. The return address is printed in a deep, confident navy ink. Whitaker Construction and Land Holdings. She has not opened it. She has been carrying it, unopened, for 3 days, in her bag, on the seat of her car, on the kitchen table where she stared at it over coffee that went cold twice, in the pocket of this same coat she is wearing now, because some part of her has been afraid that whatever is written inside those few folded pages will be the kind of sentence you cannot take back once you have read it. She turns it over once in her fingers, feeling the weight of the paper stock, the small raised texture of the letterhead beneath her thumb, and for a moment the sound of the rain seems to fall away entirely, replaced by something older and closer, a sound that lives only in memory now but has never once, in 7 years, gone completely quiet. She remembers the porch light that night. A single yellow bulb, humming faintly, moths circling it in lazy, drunken loops even in the rain, because moths, she thinks now, never seem to understand when a light is not worth flying toward. She remembers the way Denise Whitaker stood just outside its reach, her face half in shadow, her voice perfectly level, as though she were reading a grocery list rather than ending a life. She remembers the exact words. Not close to them. The exact words, because some sentences carve themselves into a person so deeply that the mind never rounds off their edges, never softens them the way it softens almost everything else with enough time. You were never one of us. For words. Simone has turned those 4 words over more times than she could ever count. In the dark, in the shower, in the quiet moment just before sleep, when the mind goes looking for old wounds the way a tongue goes looking for a loose tooth. And every time, she has arrived at the same conclusion. Denise Whitaker did not say those words in anger. She said them the way a judge reads a verdict. Calm. Certain. Already decided long before the courtroom door ever opened. Grace had been 4 months old. 4 months old. And already she had learned to cry the specific cry of a child who senses her mother's fear before she has any language to name what fear is. Simone remembers holding her against her chest that night, one arm wrapped tight beneath her, the other hand gripping the handle of a suitcase that held almost nothing useful, because she had packed it in under 6 minutes with hands that would not stop shaking. She remembers the gravel biting through the thin soles of the shoes she happened to be wearing that day. Ordinary shoes, meant for an ordinary Tuesday, not for the last walk she would ever take down this driveway, as anything resembling a member of this family. She remembers looking back once, just once, at the house behind her, its windows glowing gold and warm against the storm, every one of those rooms full of furniture and memory and a life she had believed, right up until that exact hour, was hers to keep. It was not a life she had asked for. That is the part people rarely understand when they hear the outline of this story secondhand, the part that gets lost somewhere between the words married into money and kicked out with a baby, as though those two facts alone tell you everything you need to know about a woman like Simone Carter. She had not gone looking for the Whitaker name. She had been a dietary aide at a hospital in Savannah, 23 years old, saving in small, stubborn increments toward night classes she rarely had the energy left to attend after a 12-hour shift on her feet. She met Marcus Whitaker in a hallway outside the cardiac ward, where he had come to sit with his grandfather 3 evenings a week, alone, without an entourage, without anyone from his family's construction empire trailing behind him to remind the world who he was. He did not introduce himself with his last name. It took her 3 weeks to learn it, and when she did, she nearly walked away from him entirely, because she had grown up hearing exactly what kind of family absorbs a girl like her, and exactly what kind of ending that story tends to have. She should have listened to that instinct. She thinks that now, standing at this gate, rain gathering at the collar of her coat, sliding cold down the back of her neck, she should have trusted the small, quiet voice that told her some doors, once you walk through them, are built only to swing one direction. And yet there was Marcus, who remembered she took her coffee black before she had ever told him, who learned her mother's name before Simone had thought to offer it, who proposed to her not in some manicured ballroom with string lights and a hired photographer, but at her cousin Naomi's kitchen table, over a pot of coffee gone lukewarm, because he understood, without ever being told, that Simone would have hated anything grander than that. There was a version of this story she has thought more times than she can count, where none of the rest of it ever happened, where Marcus lived, where the gate never closed behind her, where Grace grew up knowing her father's laugh instead of only his photographs. That version does not exist. It never did. And Simone has spent 7 years learning, slowly, painfully, one exhausted night at a time, how to stop reaching for a version of her life that was taken from her before she ever got the chance to hold it properly. The rain is falling harder now, the kind of steady, determined rain that Savannah gets in early autumn, warm even as it soaks through fabric, thick with the smell of wet oak leaves and distant thunder still too far off to hear. Simone has not moved from the spot just outside the gate. Her thumb runs once more over the raised letters of the envelope in her hand. Whitaker Construction. Not a personal letterhead. Not Denise's private stationery. The pale cream cardstock she used to send handwritten notes that always managed to sound like corrections rather than kindness. This is company paper. Official. Formal. The kind of letter you send when you need something to be undeniable, something a person cannot later claim they misunderstood. She thinks about the last time she stood exactly where she is standing now, 7 years ago, a suitcase at her feet instead of an envelope in her hand, a screaming infant instead of the strange, aching quiet she feels tonight. She thinks about every hard year in between. The apartment with Naomi that smelled permanently of instant coffee and baby powder. The 2 jobs stacked on top of each other like unstable furniture. always threatening to collapse. The car that got repossessed on a Tuesday morning while Grace watched from the window in her pajamas, too young to understand why her mother was crying over a car. The birthday cake made from a box mix because there was nothing else in the cabinet, and Simone had refused, on principle, to let her daughter's birthday pass with nothing at all. She thinks about all of it, standing here, and she understands something with sudden, bone-deep clarity. Whatever is inside this envelope is not simply a letter. It is a door. And doors, she has learned the hard way, are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. Her hand moves toward the latch. The iron is cold and slick with rain beneath her fingers, colder than she expected, the kind of cold that seems to travel straight up through the skin and settle somewhere behind the ribs. Somewhere beyond the gate, past the long gravel drive, she can still see in perfect detail with her eyes closed. The house is waiting. Millbrook does not change. It never has. It simply waits, patient as old money always is, certain, in the particular arrogant way that wealth is always certain, that the people it has cast aside will eventually find a reason to come back. The question is not whether Simone Carter still remembers what happened on this driveway 7 years ago. She remembers every second of it, every syllable, every drop of rain. The real question, the one that has kept her awake 3 nights running with an unopened envelope on her nightstand, is a far harder one to answer. What, after everything that family took from her, could possibly be inside that letter powerful enough to make her open this gate again? 8 years earlier, before any of it, before the rain and the suitcase and the 4 words that would follow her the rest of her life, Simone Carter was simply a young woman trying to build something steady out of very little. She worked the evening shift in the dietary department of a hospital just outside downtown Savannah, pushing carts of trays down long fluorescent-lit hallways, learning the names of patients before she ever learned the names of doctors, because it was the patients who remembered her kindness and the doctors who rarely looked up long enough to notice her at all. She was 23, sharing a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with her cousin Naomi Bishop, splitting rent down to the dollar, setting aside whatever was left at the end of each month into an envelope taped behind a dresser drawer. Money meant for night classes in nutrition science that she attended twice a week when her body wasn't too tired to sit upright through a lecture. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She had never once thought of her life in those terms. She was simply a woman doing the math on a future she intended to build with her own 2 hands, one modest paycheck at a time. She met Marcus Whitaker on a Tuesday evening in a hallway outside the cardiac care unit, where an elderly man named Samuel Whitaker had been recovering from a procedure that had frightened his entire family more than anyone wanted to admit out loud. Marcus came 3 evenings a week, alone, no assistant trailing him, no company car idling in the visitor's lot with a driver waiting. He wore his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and carried himself like a man who had spent time doing physical work rather than only signing off on it, which, Simone would later learn, was true. He had spent 2 summers during college on his family's job sites, laying foundation forms in the Georgia heat, because his grandfather Samuel had insisted that no Whitaker would run a construction company without first understanding, in his own hands, what construction actually cost a body. Their first real conversation happened by accident, the kind of accident that only happens in hallways at 10 at night when both people are too tired to keep up their guard. Simone was pushing a cart of dinner trays back toward the kitchen, and Marcus, sitting outside his grandfather's room with 2 paper cups of vending machine coffee, offered her one without asking any of the usual questions people ask when they're trying to figure out where you fit in the world. He didn't ask what she did for a living beyond the obvious uniform. He didn't ask where she was from in that particular tone people use when they're really asking whether you belong somewhere. He asked if she'd been on shift since morning, and when she said yes, he simply said that must be exhausting, and then he was quiet, letting her drink her coffee in peace, which she would later tell Naomi was the single most attractive thing a man had ever done for her. It took him 3 weeks to mention his last name, and only because Samuel, from his hospital bed, loudly informed a passing nurse that his grandson ran half the construction projects in 3 counties, a comment Marcus visibly wished he could take back the moment it left his grandfather's mouth. Simone remembers the walk to her car that night, replaying the words Whitaker construction in her head, feeling something in her chest go cold and cautious, because she had grown up hearing exactly what kind of family absorbs a woman like her, uses her for a season, and quietly sets her back down exactly where they found her. She nearly stopped answering his calls that week. She told Naomi as much, sitting at their kitchen table, turning a chipped coffee mug in slow circles. Naomi, never one to soften an opinion for the sake of comfort, told her plainly that she was allowed to be careful, but she wasn't allowed to punish a good man for the sins of people he hadn't even introduced her to yet. She kept answering the calls, and slowly, carefully, in the unhurried way real trust is built rather than declared, Marcus proved himself to be exactly as ordinary and exactly as decent as he had seemed in that hallway with 2 cups of bad coffee. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee black. He learned her mother's name, and the name of the street she'd grown up on, before Simone had ever thought to volunteer either. He drove 2 hours each way, more than once, just to sit with her at a diner near her mother's house, because he understood, without being told, that some relationships require you to show up in the places that matter to the other person rather than only the places that are convenient for you. The first time he brought her to Millbrook, she knew within the first 10 minutes of that dinner exactly how she would be measured at that table for the rest of her life. Denise Whitaker asked, in the same breath as passing the bread, where Simone's people were from, a question that carried a weight far beyond its simple wording, the kind of question designed to sort a person quickly and quietly into a category before the meal was even finished. Harold Whitaker, seated at the head of the table, was kinder in his manner but no less absent in his authority, deferring on nearly every subject to his wife's judgment with the practiced ease of a man who had learned decades earlier which battles were worth the cost of fighting. Simone answered every question that night with a steady voice and a straight spine, because her mother had raised her to never let a room like that see her flinch, whatever it cost her to hold that posture. Marcus proposed to her 7 months later, not in some grand ballroom with hired string lights and a photographer paid to capture the moment from 3 flattering angles, but at Naomi's kitchen table, on an ordinary Thursday evening, over a pot of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. He told her he didn't want to ask her somewhere fancy, because he knew she would spend the whole time worrying about whether she was using the right fork instead of actually hearing the question. He asked her to marry him the way he had done everything else since that hallway 3 weeks into knowing her, plainly, without performance, in a way built for exactly who she was rather than who a family like his might have wished she was instead. There was a prenuptial agreement drafted before the wedding, of course, because there is always a prenuptial agreement drafted before a wedding in a family like the Whitakers. Isabel Reyes, the family's longtime attorney, arrived at Millbrook one afternoon with a folder thick enough to require its own leather case, prepared, as she always was, to protect the family's holdings from every conceivable direction. Marcus refused to put the document in front of Simone. Simone remembers the exact tone of his voice when he said it, calm but immovable, telling his mother directly, in front of Isabel, that if Simone had wanted his money, she would have asked for it long before now, and he would not insult the woman he loved by asking her to prove otherwise on paper. Denise's face in that moment was a portrait Simone has never fully forgotten. A flicker of something colder than disappointment passing behind her eyes before she composed herself back into practiced neutrality. It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Simone was watching closely. She has thought about that flicker more times over the years than she ever expected to. The wedding itself was small, deliberately so, held at a modest chapel Simone's mother had attended her whole life rather than the cathedral Denise had quietly suggested twice. There were no magazine photographers, no seating chart drawn up according to donor tiers, nothing about the day that Denise Whitaker would have chosen if the choice had been left entirely to her. Simone remembers Denise's expression throughout the ceremony, polite and composed on the surface, visibly uncomfortable underneath, a woman attending an event she had not designed and could not fully control, which, Simone has come to understand since, may be the single thing Denise Whitaker has always feared most in this world. Grace was born 11 months later, in the middle of a warm Savannah spring, and for one short season, everything Simone had feared about that family seemed to fall quietly away. She remembers Denise holding her granddaughter for the first time, the older woman's usually rigid shoulders softening in a way Simone had never witnessed before or would witness again, her voice dropping into something almost tender as she counted Grace's fingers out loud. Harold cried openly at the hospital. No performance in it at all. Simply an old man overwhelmed by the sight of new life carrying his family's name forward. For a handful of weeks, Simone allowed herself to believe that whatever cold arithmetic had once measured her worth at that dinner table had finally been settled in her favor, once and for all, by the simple fact of her daughter's existence. She did not yet know how quickly that arithmetic could be reversed. She did not yet know that the same family capable of counting a newborn's fingers with tears in their eyes was equally capable, under the right pressure, of standing in the rain and telling that same child's mother that she had never truly belonged among them at all. That reversal was still months away. But looking back now, standing at this gate with an unopened envelope in her hand, Simone can see, more clearly than she ever could in the moment it was happening, the small warning signs she chose not to read too closely at the time. Denise's flicker of cold disappointment over an unsigned prenuptial agreement. Harold's habit of yielding every real decision to his wife the instant it mattered. Isabel Reyes's careful, watchful silence at every family gathering. A woman who always seemed to know slightly more than she was saying. None of it was enough, back then, to make Simone doubt the life she was building. She loved Marcus Whitaker without complication or hesitation, and for a while, that love felt like more than enough armor against anything his family might one day decide to throw at her. She did not yet know how wrong she was. She did not yet know how little time she had left before the accident that would take Marcus from her entirely, and take, along with him, every fragile piece of goodwill his family had ever extended toward her. That part of the story was still coming. It always is, in stories like this one. The warmth always arrives first, so the cold that follows it can cut all the deeper. The accident happened on a Thursday morning in early October, the kind of ordinary Thursday that gives no warning of the life it is about to end. Marcus had left the house before dawn, the way he often did that season, driving out to a job site on the western edge of the county where Whitaker Construction was clearing ground for a new distribution center, a contract Harold had been chasing for the better part of a year. Simone remembers the last thing he said to her that morning, standing in the kitchen with Grace asleep against her shoulder, not because it was profound, but because it was ordinary, the kind of small parting sentence a person says 1,000 times without ever imagining it might be the last one. He told her he'd be back in time for dinner, and he kissed the top of Grace's head, and he was gone. The call came a little after 11. Simone remembers almost nothing about the conversation itself except the sound of her own voice asking the same question 3 times, as though repetition might change the answer she was being given. A company truck Marcus had been driving that morning, one of the older vehicles still in the fleet, had gone off the shoulder of a service road on the job site and rolled twice before coming to rest against a stand of pines. The official explanation, delivered first by a site foreman and later repeated almost word for word by the county's accident report, cited a mechanical failure in the steering column, the kind of failure that investigators are supposed to catch during routine inspection, The kind of failure that should never have been allowed anywhere near a public road, let alone a job site with a man's life riding on it. Simone did not understand the full weight of that detail on the day it was given to her. She was too shattered by grief to hold on to anything except the single, unbearable fact that Marcus was gone. What she did not know, what she would not learn for years, was that this was not the first time concerns had been raised about that particular truck. It had failed 2 prior safety citations over the preceding year, citations that had been quietly resolved on paper without the vehicle ever being pulled fully from rotation. She did not know this on the day of the funeral. She barely knew her own name on the day of the funeral. The service was held at a church Denise selected, not the small chapel where Simone and Marcus had married, and Simone was seated, by careful arrangement she only noticed after the fact, near the back of the sanctuary rather than beside Harold and Denise at the front, as though her grief belonged to a lesser category than theirs. She held Grace through most of the service, the baby quiet for once, as if even a 4-month-old could sense that stillness was the only thing the room could hold. Harold wept openly, the same way he had wept at Grace's birth, grief without performance, a grandfather and a father in one collapsing frame. Denise did not weep, not once, not visibly, sitting through the entire service with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded, a composure that Simone, even in the depth of her own devastation, found herself quietly afraid of. The change in Denise did not happen all at once. It happened the way most cruelty in families like the Whitakers happens, in small, deniable increments, each one easy to dismiss on its own, each one only becoming visible as a pattern once enough of them had accumulated. It began with silence. Denise stopped returning Simone's calls within days of the funeral, calls that had, in the beginning, only been about small, practical things, questions about which of Marcus's belongings Simone should keep, questions about funeral costs that Simone, in her grief, hadn't thought to ask about directly. Then came the meetings Simone was no longer invited to, conversations about the estate and the company that used to include her as a matter of course and now, quietly, did not. Isabel Reyes came to see Simone alone about 3 weeks after the funeral, ostensibly to review some minor paperwork related to Marcus's personal accounts. Simone remembers the visit clearly, because it was the first time she noticed something unsettled behind Isabel's usually composed manner, a hesitation in her voice whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near the subject of the accident itself. At one point, gathering her folders to leave, Isabel said something Simone did not fully understand at the time and would not stop turning over in her mind for years afterward. She said that the family could not afford a lawsuit and a scandal in the same season, a sentence delivered almost to herself, as though she had forgotten Simone was still in the room to hear it. Simone did not know, then, what lawsuit Isabel meant. She assumed, in her grief, that it referred to some routine liability concern connected to the accident, the kind of legal housekeeping that follows any workplace death. She did not yet understand that the sentence carried a second, unspoken half, one that would not fully reveal itself until years later. A lawsuit over the truck, a scandal over how long the company had known about its condition, and a widow, sitting quietly in the family's orbit, who might one day have both the standing and the motive to ask the wrong questions at exactly the wrong time. The eviction came 6 weeks after the funeral, on a night that began, like so many nights that season, without any warning that it would be different from the ones before it. Simone was living, at the time, in the guest house on the Millbrook grounds, the small cottage Marcus had insisted on keeping close to his grandfather rather than moving Simone into the main house, a decision Simone had always been quietly grateful for, since it had given her and Marcus a version of privacy inside a family that rarely allowed for it. Denise arrived at the guest house a little after 8 in the evening, with Isabel a half step behind her carrying a folder, and Simone understood, The instant she opened the door and saw the two of them standing together in the porch light, that this was not a social visit. Denise did not raise her voice, not once, through the entire conversation that followed. She spoke the way she always spoke, evenly, precisely, each sentence delivered with the calm authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed without argument. She informed Simone that the guest house had always technically belonged to the estate rather than to Marcus personally, a legal distinction Simone had never once thought to question while her husband was alive, and that the family would require the property returned to its intended use within 30 days. Simone remembers asking, her voice shaking in a way Denise's never did, where exactly she and a 4-month-old infant were supposed to go with 30 days' notice and no income of her own to speak of. Denise's answer, delivered without any visible malice, without any raised inflection at all, was the sentence that would follow Simone for the rest of her life. She said that Simone had been Marcus's wife, not a Whitaker, and that whatever warmth the family had once extended to her had been extended for his sake, not her own, and that with Marcus gone, there was no longer any reasonable basis for her to remain. The 30 days did not last 30 days. Within a week, further pressure arrived in smaller, colder forms, a change to the locks on a storage unit where some of Simone's belongings had been kept, a phone call informing her that her name had been removed from an account she'd believed to be joint. Naomi Bishop, the only person who came without being asked, arrived on a Tuesday evening in her own car with an empty trunk and told Simone plainly that she wasn't leaving until every box that mattered was loaded into it. The final night, the night that would replay itself in Simone's memory for the next 7 years without ever losing a single detail, came less than 2 weeks after Denise's initial visit. Simone stood on the gravel driveway in the rain with a suitcase at her feet and Grace crying against her shoulder, and Denise stood just beyond the reach of the porch light, her face half in shadow, and said the 4 words that would outlive every warmer memory Simone had ever built inside that house. "You were never one of us." Simone did not know, standing in that rain with nothing left but a suitcase and a screaming infant, that the sentence Denise had spoken to her was not entirely true, not in the way Denise intended it. She did not know that somewhere inside the company's records, sealed away in files Isabel Reyes had quietly helped to manage for months, there existed proof of exactly why the Whitaker family needed her gone, needed her far enough outside their orbit that she would never think to ask the one question that could unravel everything. She did not know, walking down that gravel drive for what she believed at the time was the last time in her life, that the truck which killed her husband had failed inspection twice before, and that somewhere in an email thread Marcus had sent just 2 weeks before his death, there existed a version of the truth that would take her 7 long, grinding years to finally uncover. The months that followed the eviction were the hardest of Simone Carter's life, harder even than the grief of losing Marcus, because grief, however unbearable, had at least allowed her the mercy of stillness. What came next allowed her no stillness at all. She and Grace moved into Naomi Bishop's apartment on the east side of Savannah, a modest 2-bedroom above a laundromat where the hum of industrial dryers rose up through the floorboards at all hours, a sound Simone came, in time, almost to find comforting, since it meant she was not alone with her thoughts in the quiet. She took whatever work she could find. A second shift at a different hospital, further from home, because her old position had been filled within a month of her sudden leave of absence. Weekend hours at a grocery store when the hospital shifts weren't enough to cover rent and formula, and the growing list of things a baby needs that no one warns you about until you're standing in a store aisle at midnight trying to decide between diapers and dinner. The night classes she had once been saving for sat forgotten. The money in the envelope behind the dresser long since spent on more urgent things. She did not resent this, not really, though there were nights, rocking Grace to sleep in the thin light from a street lamp outside Naomi's window, when she allowed herself a few private minutes to grieve the version of her future she had once been quietly building for herself before any of this began. Naomi carried a great deal of that first year without ever making Simone feel like a burden for needing it. She was blunt in the way only family can be blunt, telling Simone plainly, more than once, that she was allowed to fall apart in the apartment as long as she pulled herself back together before Grace woke up. Because a child that age doesn't need a mother who's put together, she needs a mother who shows up. It was Naomi who noticed, before Simone did, that something had shifted in how the Whitakers were handling even the smallest interactions with them now, no longer simply distant, but actively, deliberately closed off. The first sign came when Simone tried to add the Whitaker name to Grace's school enrollment paperwork the following year, a small administrative detail that should have required nothing more than a birth certificate. Within days, a letter arrived from a law firm Simone had never heard of, one she would later learn had been retained specifically to handle matters the family did not want traced back to Isabel Reyes directly. The letter was polite in its language and unmistakable in its intent, informing Simone that any attempt to formally associate her daughter's identity with the Whitaker name or estate would be treated as a matter requiring legal review, a threat dressed up in enough careful phrasing to avoid sounding like exactly what it was. Worse than the letter itself was what followed quietly in its wake. Harold Whitaker, who had wept without shame at his granddaughter's birth, who had continued, in the early months after the eviction, to arrange occasional visits with Grace through a mutual understanding that predated any of the family's colder decisions, found those visits growing steadily harder to schedule. A call postponed, a visit shortened without real explanation. And then, within a matter of months, no visits at all, the arrangement simply allowed to dissolve without anyone ever formally ending it, which Simone came to understand was its own kind of cruelty, one that left no single moment to point to and be angry about, only a slow erosion that left Grace, by her second birthday, with no memory of her only living grandparent on her father's side at all. The financial pressure compounded steadily through that period, the kind of grinding, cumulative hardship that rarely announces itself in a single dramatic event and instead simply builds, week over week, until the weight of it becomes impossible to set down even for a moment. Simone's car, an older sedan that had been struggling for over a year, was repossessed on a Tuesday morning when she fell 2 payments behind after a stretch of reduced hours at the hospital. She remembers Grace watching from the apartment window in her pajamas, not yet old enough to understand what was happening, only old enough to sense, in the particular quiet stillness of her mother's posture, that something had gone wrong. There was a stretch of nearly 8 months where Simone worked both jobs simultaneously, sleeping in fractured pieces of 4 hours here, 3 hours there, arriving at each shift on time, through sheer discipline rather than any real reserve of energy left to draw on. Grace's second birthday fell during one of the leanest stretches of that year, and Simone remembers standing in the kitchen the night before, counting out what remained in her wallet, deciding between a proper cake from the bakery 2 blocks over and the ingredients for dinner that week. She chose the box mix from the corner store instead, the plainest yellow cake with plain white frosting, and she remembers crying quietly at the counter while it baked, not for herself, but for the version of this birthday Grace would have had if none of the last 2 years had happened the way they did. Grace, of course, remembers none of this. She remembers only that her mother sang to her before she blew out 2 candles, and that the cake, however plain, tasted like something worth celebrating. Children, Simone has come to understand, forgive circumstances long before the adults around them are able to forgive themselves for those same circumstances. It was during this period, roughly a year and a half after the eviction, that Simone stumbled onto the detail that would eventually change everything, though she did not recognize its significance at the time. She had been going through an old laptop that had belonged to her and Marcus jointly, trying to recover photographs from Grace's first months that she feared she had lost, when she noticed that a cloud storage account tied to Marcus's old work email had, for reasons neither she nor anyone else had thought to correct, remained quietly synced to the device. Scrolling through months of old messages she had no real reason to be reading, she found herself pausing on one in particular, sent from Marcus's account to Isabel Reyes, dated exactly 2 weeks before the accident that killed him. The subject line was cut off in the preview, a single fragment of text she could not fully make sense of. The body of the message was truncated in the same way, ending mid-sentence on the words "the truck inspection report," before the rest of it disappeared behind a login screen the account no longer had active access to, locked, she would later confirm, by Denise's legal team in the weeks following the funeral, ostensibly as a routine security measure for a deceased employee's credentials. Simone sat with that fragment of a sentence for a long time that night, Grace asleep in the next room, the laundromat dryers humming faintly through the floor below. She did not yet understand what it meant. She only understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest and never fully left it again, that it meant something, and that whatever it meant had been buried behind that login screen on purpose. She tried, over the following weeks, every method she could think of to recover the rest of that message. She contacted the email provider directly, only to be told that account access required either the original credentials or a court order, and she had neither the money nor the legal footing at the time to pursue the second option. She asked Isabel Reyes about it once, carefully, during one of the rare, brief conversations the two women still occasionally had regarding minor estate paperwork, framing the question as though she were simply trying to recover old photographs of Marcus. Isabel's response was too quick, too smooth, a practiced deflection that told Simone, more clearly than any direct answer could have, that Isabel knew exactly what that message contained and had no intention of letting Simone anywhere near it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a question you cannot answer and cannot afford to keep chasing, and Simone lived inside that exhaustion for the better part of the next several years. She could not fight the Whitakers over an email fragment with no proof behind it, not while she was working double shifts and raising a daughter largely on her own, not while every hour spent chasing an unanswerable mystery was an hour taken away from the far more urgent business of survival. She set the question aside, the way a person sets aside a splinter too deep to safely remove, telling herself she would return to it when circumstances allowed. She did not know, in those exhausted months, how long it would be before circumstances finally did allow it, or what it would eventually cost her to learn the truth those buried words had been protecting all along. 3 years passed in the particular way that hard years pass, slowly in the living of them, and quickly in the looking back, each one blending into the next through the sheer repetition of survival. Simone found steadier footing eventually, not through any single turn of luck, but through the accumulation of small, hard-won stability. She completed her nutrition certification at last, 2 years later than she had once planned, studying in stolen half hours after Grace had gone to sleep, and the certification opened a position at the hospital that paid enough to finally let her breathe, without counting every dollar twice before spending it. She and Grace moved out of Naomi's apartment above the laundromat, and into a small rental of their own, modest but theirs, with a bedroom Grace could decorate however she wanted and a kitchen where Simone no longer had to choose between a proper cake and dinner for the week. Grace grew, the way children do, seemingly all at once, and also so gradually that Simone sometimes struggled to pinpoint exactly when her daughter had stopped being a baby and become a person with her own opinions, her own stubborn streak, her own particular way of tilting her head when she sensed an adult wasn't telling her the whole truth about something. She asked about her father in the specific, matter-of-fact way children ask about things they've only ever known through photographs and other people's memories, and Simone answered those questions as honestly as she could, without burdening a small child with the weight of everything that had happened after Marcus died. She told Grace that her father had been kind, that he had loved her more in 4 months than some people manage to love anyone in a lifetime, that he had a laugh you could hear from another room. She did not tell Grace, not yet, about the gate, or the rain, or the 4 words that still occasionally surfaced in her own dreams. Some truths, Simone had decided, belonged to her alone to carry until Grace was old enough to help carry them. It was in the spring of Grace's 6th year that the past reached back into Simone's carefully rebuilt life for the first time since the eviction. The call came from an insurance investigator working on behalf of Whitaker Construction's carrier, a man named Gerald Foster, whose voice on the phone was polite in the practiced, procedural way of someone reading from a script he had read many times before. He explained that as Marcus's legal widow, Simone's signature was still required to formally close out a portion of the workers' compensation claim connected to his death, a claim that had apparently remained technically open in some administrative limbo for years, overlooked, or perhaps deliberately left unresolved. Simone couldn't yet tell which. What struck her most about that call was not the request itself, but an offhand remark Foster made near the end of it, mentioning, almost as an aside, that closing the claim would also finalize matters related to Marcus's life insurance policy through the company. Simone remembers sitting very still at her kitchen table after that call ended, turning the sentence over in her mind. She had never once been told that Marcus carried a life insurance policy through Whitaker Construction. In 6 years, through every conversation about the estate, every piece of paperwork Isabel Reyes had ever placed in front of her to sign in the immediate aftermath of the funeral, that detail had simply never come up. She called Isabel directly, for the first time in over 2 years, and asked her plainly why she had never been informed of any such policy. There was a pause on the line long enough that Simone knew, before Isabel said a single word, that the silence itself was an answer. Isabel arrived at Simone's house 2 days later, alone, without notifying Denise, a fact Simone understood the significance of the moment. She saw the older woman standing on her porch, glancing back toward the street, as though checking whether she'd been followed. The conversation that followed was unlike any Isabel had ever allowed herself to have with Simone before. She did not explain everything, not that day, but she said enough, choosing her words with the careful precision of a lawyer who understood exactly how much she could say without crossing a line she wasn't yet ready to cross. She told Simone not to sign anything Foster or the company sent her without first having her own attorney review it, someone with no connection whatsoever to Whitaker Construction or its counsel. She told her, in a voice that shook slightly despite her efforts to keep it level, that there were things about the accident, and about the years since, that Simone deserved to understand fully before she agreed to close anything. Simone asked her directly, sitting across the kitchen table from the woman who had once stood beside Denise on the night of the eviction, why, after 6 years of silence, Isabel was choosing to say even this much now. Isabel didn't answer the question directly. She simply looked down at her hands for a long moment and said that some debts don't disappear just because you've spent years pretending you don't owe them, and that she had spent 6 years pretending. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and left, leaving Simone with more questions than she had walked in with. For the first time since Grace's birth, Simone found herself standing at a genuine crossroads, one she had not chosen and had not seen coming. She could sign whatever papers Foster's firm eventually sent, close the claim, accept whatever settlement the insurance policy provided, and finally, formally, sever the last legal thread still connecting her and Grace to the Whitaker family, a clean, final ending to 7 years of grief she had never fully been allowed to put down. Or she could do what every instinct in her body, sharpened by years of learning exactly how far that family was willing to go to protect its own interests, was telling her to do instead. She could ask why Marcus had sent an email about a truck inspection report 2 weeks before that same truck killed him. She could ask why that email had been locked behind a login screen for 6 years. She could ask, finally, out loud, to people with the power to answer, what exactly Denise Whitaker had been protecting the night she stood in the rain and told Simone she had never truly belonged. She thought, for several days, about walking away entirely. There was a version of peace available to her in simply letting the past stay buried, in taking whatever the insurance settlement offered, and building the rest of her and Grace's life somewhere the Whitaker name never had to come up again. She was tired, in the particular deep-boned way that 7 years of fighting alone leaves a person tired, and there were nights that week when the idea of simply signing the papers and walking away felt less like surrender and more like mercy toward herself. But then there were the nights she thought about Grace, 7 years old now, growing more curious with each passing year about a father she had never truly known and a grandfather she couldn't remember at all, a little girl who deserved, someday, to understand the truth of her own history rather than a version of it shaped entirely by people who had every reason to keep the real story buried. And there was the fragment of that email, still lodged in Simone's memory after 6 years exactly as clearly as the night she first read it. The truck inspection report. 6 words, cut off mid-sentence, that had never once stopped asking to be finished. She made her decision the way she had made every hard decision since the night she walked down that gravel driveway in the rain, quietly, deliberately, without asking anyone's permission to feel the way she felt. She would not simply sign the papers. She hired a lawyer of her own, a young solo practitioner named Marcus Bennett, no relation to her late husband beyond the coincidence of a shared first name, a detail that struck her the first time she read his intake form and felt, however briefly, like something close to a sign. Bennett was young enough that Simone worried, at first, whether he had the experience to stand against a firm the size of the one representing Whitaker Construction. What he lacked in years, he made up for in a hunger for exactly this kind of case, the kind built on the quiet conviction that ordinary people deserved lawyers willing to fight as hard as the ones the wealthy could afford to hire in bulk. Together, they began the slow, careful work of requesting records the company was legally obligated to provide, but had never before had any real reason to release. Inspection histories, maintenance logs, personnel files connected to the site where Marcus had died. It was slow going, deliberately obstructed at nearly every turn by the same firm that had once sent Simone a letter warning her against associating her own daughter's name with the Whitakers. But it was progress, real progress, the first Simone had made in 6 years toward understanding what had actually happened on that job site the morning her husband died, and toward understanding, finally, why the woman who once called her family had been so determined, from the very first weeks of her grief, to push her as far outside that family's reach as possible. The break came not from anything Simone or Marcus Bennett uncovered directly, but from a man neither of them had ever met, a former site inspector named Charles Odom, who had worked for Whitaker Construction for nearly 11 years before leaving the company under circumstances he had never fully explained to anyone outside his own family. Odom reached out to Bennett's office on his own initiative, after word of the record's request had quietly made its way through channels Simone never fully understood, channels that exist in every industry among people who remember things companies would prefer they forget. Odom had been the inspector assigned to the Western County Fleet the year before Marcus's death, and he told Bennett, in a recorded statement that took the better part of an afternoon to complete, that he had flagged the specific truck involved in the accident not once but twice, citing a steering column defect that should have grounded the vehicle immediately under any reasonable safety standard. Both times, he said, his reports had gone up the chain to a senior operations manager and simply never come back down with any record of action taken. He had raised the issue a third time, verbally, directly to Harold Whitaker himself at a site meeting, only to be told the matter was being handled and to focus on his own assigned responsibilities. 2 months after that conversation, Marcus Whitaker was killed driving that same truck. Odom left the company within the year, quietly, without ever going public, because he had a family of his own to support, and a lawsuit against a company the size of Whitaker Construction was not a fight he could afford to lose. What made Odom's statement different from anything Simone had managed to piece together alone was a single detail he mentioned almost in passing, one that landed in the quiet hospital break room, where Simone was sitting with Bennett on speakerphone like a physical blow to the chest. Odom said that in the weeks before the accident, he had been contacted directly by Marcus Whitaker, not through any official channel, but personally, by phone, with Marcus asking pointed, specific questions about the exact steering defect Odom had flagged twice already. Marcus had told him, in that call, that he intended to bring the inspection failures directly to the board, over his mother's objections, because he believed the company had a legal and moral obligation to ground the entire affected fleet immediately rather than continue operating it while a fix was scheduled on the company's own convenient timeline. Simone sat with that information for a long time after the call ended, Bennett's voice fading into background noise as she worked through what it meant. Marcus had known. Not vaguely, not in the abstract way a company owner might sense something was wrong somewhere in his operations, but specifically, personally, 2 weeks before his death, Marcus had been actively building a case to force his own family's company to do the right thing, over his mother's explicit objection. The email fragment Simone had found years earlier, the one ending mid-sentence on the truck inspection report, suddenly made a different kind of sense. Marcus hadn't simply been forwarding a routine document to Isabel Reyes. He had been building a paper trail, gathering evidence, preparing to force his mother's hand on an issue she had apparently decided was not worth the cost of addressing. Within days of receiving Odom's full statement, Bennett received a call of his own, this one from Isabel Reyes directly, requesting an in-person meeting rather than continuing through the formal channels the firms had been using. Simone insisted on attending. Isabel met them not at her office, but at a quiet coffee shop several miles from downtown Savannah. Choosing, Simone understood without being told, a location deliberately far from anywhere Denise's network of employees and associates might happen to notice the three of them together. Isabel looked older than Simone remembered, the composed authority she had always carried replaced by something closer to exhaustion. She told them, without much preamble, that she had made her decision, and that decision was to hand over the full, unredacted email account Marcus had used, the one that had remained locked behind a login screen for 6 years, along with a set of internal memos she herself had authored over that same period. Memos Denise had instructed her to draft summarizing the family's legal exposure regarding the fleet's inspection history. Isabel said she had carried the weight of those memos for 6 years, watching Simone struggle in the aftermath of a tragedy the company could have prevented, and she was no longer willing to carry it silently. The full email, once finally recovered, confirmed everything Odom's statement had suggested and more. Marcus had written to Isabel not once but 3 times in the 2 weeks before his death, each message more urgent than the last, laying out in plain, specific language the inspection failures Odom had flagged, the verbal warning Harold had personally received and dismissed, and Marcus's explicit intention to bring the matter before the full board within the month, publicly if necessary, regardless of what it might cost his family's reputation or his mother's standing within the company. The final message, sent 4 days before the accident, contained a single line that Simone read over and over the first time she saw it in full. If something happens to that fleet before this gets fixed, it will be on all of us, and I won't be quiet about it just because it's our name on the trucks. Harold Whitaker's letter arrived less than 2 weeks after that meeting with Isabel, the same envelope Simone would eventually stand holding at the gate, heavy cream paper stamped with the company's official letterhead rather than Denise's personal stationery, a distinction Simone would only fully understand once she finally opened it. The letter was brief, written, she would later learn, without Denise's knowledge, sent by Harold directly and quietly through a company assistant he trusted, bypassing both his wife and Isabel entirely. It asked Simone to come to Millbrook in person as soon as she was willing, explaining that the company was now the subject of a formal safety audit triggered by Odom's willingness to go on record, and that there were things Harold needed to say to her, things he had let go unsaid for far too many years, that he did not believe he had the right to put on paper. Simone stood outside the Millbrook gate 3 days after receiving that letter, the same wrought iron she had walked away from 7 years earlier, rain just beginning to fall around her exactly as it had the night she left, the envelope still unopened in her hand, because she had already learned everything it needed to say to her through other means, and some part of her needed, before she went any further, simply to stand in this exact spot and remember every version of herself that had ever stood here before. The frightened young mother with a suitcase and a screaming infant. The exhausted woman working double shifts who had once tried and failed to recover a locked email. And now, finally, a woman who understood, in full, precisely what had been buried behind that gate for 7 long years, and precisely what it was going to cost the people inside that house to finally answer for it. She reached for the latch. The iron was cold beneath her fingers, exactly as cold as she remembered. And for the first time in 7 years, Simone Carter walked through the gates of Millbrook not as someone waiting to be judged, but as someone finally, fully prepared to demand the truth from the people who had spent 7 years hoping she never would. The gravel drive felt shorter than Simone remembered, though she knew, walking it now, that the distance itself had never changed. What had changed was her. She walked past the same stand of oaks that lined the drive, past the same low stone wall marking the edge of the property, past the guest house where she and Marcus had once built a life together in the shadow of a family that never fully accepted either of them for what they were rather than what they represented. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time she reached the front steps, and she stood there for a moment, the same way she had stood at the gate, gathering whatever remained of her composure before she reached for the door. Harold answered it himself, which surprised her, though it shouldn't have. He looked smaller than she remembered, his frame diminished in the particular way illness diminishes a person, his hands trembling faintly as he reached out to take hers in both of his own. He did not say much. He simply looked at her for a long moment, his eyes wet, and said only that he was glad she had come, before stepping aside to let her into the house she had once believed would never open its doors to her again. Denise was waiting in the dining room, seated at the same long table where Simone had once been asked, over a past basket of bread, where her people were from. She looked older too, though age had settled on her differently than it had on Harold, sharpening rather than softening the lines of her face, leaving her posture as rigid and controlled as it had always been, even now, even with everything Simone knew waiting just beneath the surface of this conversation. Isabel Reyes stood near the window, arms folded, her expression unreadable in the particular way of someone who had already made peace with whatever was about to happen and simply needed to watch it unfold. Simone did not sit down right away. She stood at the head of the table opposite Denise, the rain still audible against the tall windows behind her, and she said, without preamble, that she knew about the truck. She knew about Odom's reports, filed twice and buried twice. She knew about the verbal warning Harold had received directly at a site meeting and dismissed. She knew about Marcus's emails, all 3 of them, and the line he had written 4 days before his death, promising he would not stay quiet just because it was his family's name on the trucks. She said all of this evenly, without raising her voice, because she had spent 7 years learning that Denise Whitaker respected nothing so much as composure, and she was not about to give this woman the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in this room the way she once had. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Harold lowered himself slowly into a chair at the table, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance as though he could not bring himself to look directly at either woman while the truth finally settled over the room. Denise did not look away. She had never once, in Simone's experience, looked away from anything, and she did not start now. But something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, a slight loosening in the rigid set of her shoulders, as though some weight she had been carrying for 7 years had finally been given permission to show itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the cold, controlled instrument Simone remembered from the night of the eviction. It was lower, quieter, stripped of its usual precision, the voice of a woman who had run out of ways to avoid the thing she was about to say. She told Simone that she had known about the steering defect before Marcus's death, not the full extent of it, not the specific danger Odom had flagged, but enough to know that fixing it properly would have grounded a significant portion of the fleet for weeks, delaying the distribution center contract the company had been chasing for over a year, a contract Denise had staked the company's financial future on securing. She said she had told herself, at the time, that the fix could wait a few more weeks, that the risk was manageable, that Odom's reports were the kind of routine caution any inspector gives when he wants extra time built into a schedule. She said Marcus had confronted her directly, 10 days before his death, telling her plainly that he intended to bring the matter to the board regardless of what it cost the contract or the company's reputation, and that she had told him, in words she said she had regretted every day since, that he was choosing sentiment over the survival of everything 3 generations of this family had built. She said she had not ordered anyone to keep him quiet. She had not needed to. She had simply refused to fix the trucks in time, and 2 weeks later, her son was dead, and in the crushing weight of that grief, she had needed someone else to blame, because she could not survive carrying the alternative, which was that her own refusal to act had killed her only child. Simone stood very still through all of this, feeling something in her chest that was not quite the anger she had expected to feel, walking into this room, and not quite the grief she had spent 7 years carrying either. It was something closer to a strange, unbearable clarity, the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place after 7 years of not fully understanding why a grieving mother had chosen, of all the ways she might have processed her son's death, to turn that grief into cruelty aimed at the one person who had loved him as much as she had. She said, quietly, that Denise hadn't just failed to protect her after Marcus died. She had failed to protect him first, and every cold word spoken in the rain that night, every locked account, every blocked visit between Grace and her grandfather, had been Denise punishing the one person left alive who reminded her, every time she looked at her, of exactly what her own decision had cost. Denise did not deny it. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her composure finally, fully broken, and for the first time in 7 years, Simone watched Denise Whitaker weep, not with the performed grief of the funeral, but with the raw, unguarded devastation of a woman finally forced to say out loud the thing she had spent 7 years running from. Harold reached across the table then, his trembling hand finding Simone's, and he said, in a voice thick with an old man's grief, that he should have grounded the fleet himself the moment Odom first raised the alarm, that his silence in that meeting had cost him a grandson's laughter for 7 years and a son's life before that, and that whatever remained of his time on this earth, he intended to spend making right what could still be made right, however small that might feel against everything already lost. Grace was waiting in the car outside, 7 years old, unaware of the full weight of what was unfolding inside that house, and Simone understood, sitting in that room with the truth finally, fully laid bare before her, that everything that happened next would not simply be about her own reckoning with the family that had cast her out. It would be about what kind of history she chose to hand her daughter, what kind of justice she was willing to seek, and what kind of forgiveness, if any, she was willing to extend to people who had caused so much harm out of a fear that had, in the end, cost them all so much more than they had ever managed to protect. The days that followed that conversation at Millbrook were unlike any Simone had known since the night she first walked away from that house 7 years earlier. She did not leave with any grand declaration, no dramatic ultimatum thrown across the dining table the way such moments so often unfold in the stories people tell about families like the Whitakers. She left quietly, the way she had learned to do everything that mattered most in her life, and she spent the following week sitting with Marcus Bennett, laying out on the small table in his cramped downtown office everything Isabel Reyes had finally surrendered, everything Charles Odom had put on record, everything Denise herself had admitted with her own trembling voice in that dining room. Bennett asked her plainly what she wanted to do with it, because he understood, better than most lawyers his age, that a piece of evidence this damaging could be used in more than one direction. She could take it to the press, and within a week, the story would dominate every local news outlet in Savannah and likely several national ones beyond it. The collapse of a respected construction dynasty built on a mother's fatal choice to protect a contract over her own son's warning. It would destroy the company entirely, and along with it, the livelihoods of the hundreds of ordinary families across 3 counties who depended on Whitaker construction for their paychecks. Families who had done nothing wrong and had no part in the decision that killed Marcus. Or she could use what she had more quietly, more surgically, forcing accountability without detonating the whole structure and everyone innocent still standing inside it. Simone thought about this longer than she thought about almost any decision in the 7 years since the eviction. She thought about the mechanics standing in stalled bays at the company's job sites, the office assistants and site foremen and payroll clerks who had built ordinary lives around a company they had no hand in corrupting. She thought, too, about every other family who might, right now, unknowingly be driving trucks with the same kind of defect Odom had flagged twice and been ignored twice. Families with no attorney, no email fragment, no 7 years of quiet, grinding persistence to eventually uncover what had been buried. And she thought about Grace, 7 years old, watching her mother from somewhere just beyond the edge of every one of these decisions, learning, whether Simone intended it or not, what justice looked like when it was finally within reach. She chose a path that gave her both the accountability she needed and the restraint she wanted to be able to explain to her daughter one day without shame. Working with Bennett, she used Odom's sworn statement and Marcus's recovered emails not as ammunition for a headline, but as leverage for a binding settlement that forced Whitaker Construction into an immediate, independently audited safety recall of every vehicle in its aging fleet, along with the creation of a compensation fund for any employee or family who could demonstrate harm connected to equipment failures the company had known about and failed to correct. The recall became public, as it legally had to, but the specific detail of Denise's personal role in delaying the fix, the conversation where she had chosen a contract over her own son's warning, remained contained within the private settlement documents rather than splashed across any front page. She told Denise this decision herself, in a second, shorter meeting at Millbrook, without Isabel or Harold present this time. She said she was not doing this so Denise could feel absolved, because absolution, she said, was not hers to give, not for something this large. She was doing it because hundreds of families deserved to know their trucks were safe, and because her own daughter deserved, one day, to hear the full truth of her father's death without that truth being permanently attached to a public spectacle that would follow Grace for the rest of her life every time someone searched her family's name. She told Denise plainly that she was choosing mercy toward the innocent, not mercy toward her, and Denise, for the first time in the whole of their difficult history, did not argue the distinction. Harold's health continued its slow decline through the months that followed, but he used what strength remained to him with a deliberateness that surprised even Isabel, who had known him for 3 decades. He formally reinstated Grace's standing within the family's estate planning, not as a gesture of sentiment, but as a matter of legal record, ensuring that whatever came of the company's future, His granddaughter's place within it could never again be quietly erased the way it had been erased once before. Separately, in a decision that had nothing to do with the company at all, he established a trust in Marcus's name, placing Simone in sole control of it. Not as charity, he told her directly, but as restitution for 7 years his family had cost her that could never fully be repaid regardless of what sum was attached to the gesture. Isabel Reyes resigned from her position as the family's attorney within the month, a decision she made on her own terms rather than waiting to be asked. She told Simone, in their last conversation before she stepped away entirely, that she had spent 30 years protecting the Whitaker name from every threat except the one that had mattered most, the family's own capacity to protect itself from the truth of its choices, and she no longer had the stomach to keep doing so. Simone did not ask her to stay, and did not tell her she forgave her either. Some debts, she had come to understand, are not owed forgiveness so much as they are owed the simple dignity of being acknowledged for what they were. 7 years, almost to the week, after the night Simone Carter walked down the gravel driveway of Millbrook with a suitcase in one hand and her infant daughter against her shoulder, she stood at that same wrought iron gate once more. The rain from that earlier visit long since cleared. The sky over Savannah washed pale and quiet in the particular way it settles after a storm has finally passed all the way through. Grace stood beside her this time, 7 years old, her hand in her mother's rather than carried against her chest, tall enough now to look up at the same iron scrollwork Simone remembered staring at through tears on the worst night of her life, and to ask, in the plain, curious way children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding, whether this was the house her father grew up in. Simone told her it was. She told her that inside that house was a grandfather who loved her very much and had waited a long time to finally get to know her properly, and a grandmother who had made a great many mistakes but was trying, in whatever time she had left, to understand the weight of them. Denise was waiting on the porch when they came up the drive, and she did not rush toward them, did not attempt some grand, performed reconciliation that Simone would have seen through instantly, and Grace would have sensed the falseness of even without understanding why. She simply waited, and when they reached the steps, she knelt down slowly to Grace's height, the way Simone remembered Denise once doing when Grace was only days old, counting her granddaughter's fingers with tears in her eyes before any of the rest of this had happened. Denise said Marcus's name to his daughter for the first time in 7 years, told her, in a voice far softer than Simone had ever once believed that woman capable of, that Grace had her father's exact laugh, that she'd heard it once already from the porch, and it had nearly undone her, hearing it again after all this time. Grace, unaware of the full history behind the moment, simply smiled the way children smile when an adult finally says something true to them instead of something managed, and reached out to take her grandmother's hand. Simone stood a step back from the two of them, watching, and she understood, more clearly than she had understood anything in the whole of the past 7 years, that she had not come back to this house for Millbrook, or for the trust Harold had established, or even, in the end, for whatever thin, imperfect forgiveness Denise might now be capable of offering. She had come back so that Grace would know exactly where she came from, the whole of it, the love and the failure both, without ever having to carry a single ounce of shame that had never been rightfully hers to hold in the first place. The rain that had followed her through so much of this story had finally, fully cleared, and as the three of them walked together up the last stretch of that gravel drive, Simone Carter allowed herself, for the first time in 7 years, to simply be still.